My name is Massimo Renzo. I'm a reader in the law school, and I'm delighted to introduce our next panel and the speakers of the panel, Professor Sabina Alkire and Professor Colleen Murphy. Sabina is the director of the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, which is part of the Department of International Development at Oxford. She's done important work on multidimensional poverty measurement and analysis, welfare economics, capability approach, the measurement of freedom and human development. Whereas Colleen is professor in the College of Law at the University of Illinois, and she works primarily in jurisprudence, transitional justice, and risk ethics. So this session, as you'll see, partly connects to the first session we had this morning, as it will look again from a different perspective at the relationship between human rights and development. So I'll leave the floor to Sabina.
Thank you all so much for being here on a Friday afternoon, quite late. What I'd like to do is do a slightly different session in trying to collect many of the rich insights that we've had today from the presentations, but in a very much more applied sense. Think about indicators and about economic or statistical applications. I mean, we've started from many different points to recognize that development, in a sense, is now inherently multidimensional, and it has been for a long time, as Sekiko would have said many years ago. But I think with the Sustainable Development Goals, there's perhaps an unrecognized switch to the extent to which that is a very widely recognized concept. And so, for example, in the final document of the Sustainable Development Goals that was launched not this year, but in 2015 at the UN General Assembly, very much development was articulated as, and poverty was articulated as multidimensional. So the second sentence in the preamble recognizes poverty not as a monetary concept, but something which has many forms and dimensions. And similarly, the Sustainable Development Goals as a whole have a multidimensional framework with economic, social, and environmental dimensions alongside them. And the extent to which this is a shift from an earlier paradigm of simple focus on economic growth, I think, gives space to explore quite seriously empirical applications of many of the concepts that we have been speaking about today. And certainly already many are proliferating. So there are a number of measures which try to capture multiple aspects of development in some overall composite way. The most famous being perhaps initially the Human Development Index or Physical Quality of Life Index. But more recently there are many new indices which are coming about. I mentioned in this slide some of the international indices which cover many, many different countries and are regularly released and used to rank countries. But what's interesting about each of them is that they draw together different dimensions in a sense of development, and try to argue that looking at any one of them in isolation is insufficient. Not all of them, but some of these new measures, both the international ones I listed and much more national measures of well-being, draw on a rights framework. And alongside these better known international indicators like OECD's Better Quality of Life Index, are many countries which are doing measures of well-being, not only in the United Kingdom, but Japan or Netherlands or Germany or Ecuador, Bhutan, Bolivia. They all have measurement work in progress to have a better approach to measuring of well-being. And for example, in the cases of Ecuador and Bolivia, their framework is very much based on a rights concept which is melded in their context with the cosmovision of buen vivir, to live well. But in Ecuador, very much it's the rights in their constitution which are shaping their measurement exercise. And so in these many different measures, human rights language is used in different ways. First of all, to articulate a sense of obligation that governments or other actors would have to address deprivations in any of the incorporated rights, but also to justify which dimensions indicators to include, and, as we ended the last session by mentioning, which to exclude, because including everything is perhaps not the way forward. But also to set standards. How much is enough? What kind of level of achievements in health or education or work or safety require a concerted attention? And then, as I will mention shortly, there's also use in some of the measures to justify the weighting structures or other parameters with reference to the human rights literature. So this is a general topic, and I think if we wade into it, we will get lost. So what I propose to do is simply give one particular kind of measure and show two examples of rights-based appropriations of that measure, and close with some observations of strengths and weaknesses of those two particular cases. And they may be very different, and there might be some perfect applications out there, but it may be at least a useful place to start the conversation, and it may be that some of the observations are also relevant to other rights-based measures. And it certainly draws on many of the things that have been stated earlier. Sakiko's point that we do need to think about governance and how indicators will be used comes up very strongly. Paul Hent's observation that you also need the voices of citizens. You need an active, dynamic consensus and engaging people's agency, not just coming in with a rigid theoretical framework. So hopefully these will give you some texture and examples. So very briefly, the measure I'm going to use to illustrate this is a poverty measure, and you can have any number of dimensions and any number of indicators. I'd first like to introduce the vocabulary. So a multidimensional poverty measure, you have dimensions which are simple conceptual categories. There's no mathematics, no data behind them. They're organizing concepts. Tony Atkinson suggests that dimensions be chosen such that their weights are relatively equal, not for any human rights perspective, but because then policymakers might understand them. And so in most of the measures that have been released, these categories are actually used to justify a weighting structure. So in this case, health, education, and living standard are equally weighted. This is a measure of global poverty that we've estimated and UNDP has published since 2010. And there are sets then of indicators, and by indicators I mean numbers for each person, indicating whether or not they are deprived in something. So for example, nutrition is a 0-1 indicator. You are deprived if anybody in your household, in this particular example, is malnourished by or you are deprived if a child has died in your house. Weights are affixed to the indicators. And in this example, the conceptual categories of dimensions are equally weighted, but the indicators receive specific weights, and they are nested. So the health and education indicators receive the weight of 1/6 and living standard of 1/18. And then there's a term deprivation cutoff, which is how much is enough? What does a right require if you were using the human rights language, which this measure does not use? But for example, body mass index for adults is measured by 18.5, and for children, 2 standard deviations away from the median, according to World Health Organization growth standards. So these are quite particular standards which have to be decided for every indicator, so that at the end of the day, you can identify every person or every household as deprived or non-deprived according to a particular definition. And there's only one other parameter, which I'll introduce in a minute. So how this particular measure is used is that for each person, all 10 of these indicators are applied. So each person has their profile of 10 indicators. So this woman, Tabitha from Kenya, Lunga Lunga, she has 5 deprivations: nutrition, sanitation, water, electricity, and asset ownership. And likewise, every person in the data set or the sample would have their particular profile of deprivations that they experience. And so, as somebody said earlier today, we're looking at, and Martha talked about clusters of poverty, we're looking at overlapping deprivations that are striking people in the same period, that is in the survey data set that we're looking at. And the last parameter to introduce in terms of vocabulary is a poverty cutoff. So we want at the end of the day for a poverty measure to identify who is poor. And that means deciding whether every deprivation matters. And we'll talk about that in a rights environment in a moment. But here, for example, we have lots of data errors. Roofs may not matter in the desert. Well, maybe they may not matter in certain climatic zones. Floors may matter, but we didn't have data for floors for 5.4 billion people. Similarly, malnutrition may be a cause of your occupation. It may be that you are recovering from an illness, that you're a fashion model. There may be reasons that you have a low body mass index that are not poverty related. And so because of those errors and also preferences, in this measure a person is identified as poor if they are deprived in 1/3 of the indicators at the same time. So that's the poverty cutoff. So those are the words that we'll return to. This is a particular school of measures, but I'm not going to go into them here. I'll give 3 examples also of how these kind of poverty measures in their analysis may also be interesting, but that's really not the focus of this paper. One is, in a sense, just to identify particularly poor groups. So this measure can be broken down subnationally or by ethnic group, by racial group, by age, by different identities. And so it may be of interest to look at those. And also it can also be broken down to see what indicators, and you could also think of these as what rights are being violated in the same time and how these differ across different regions. These are the regions of Nigeria, for example. So it's a very crude measure, but these are the concepts that might be of use. And if you look across time, you can also see if some groups, in a sense, are being left behind. So these are ethnic groups in Benin, and their initial level of poverty is on the horizontal axis. So the far right are the poorest group, the Poon. And it's a race to the bottom, so it's how fast they've gone, which is mapped vertically, with those that are furthest down that have reduced poverty the fastest. So this is a sad figure, because the poorest group have not reduced poverty at all. And similarly, you can look at another place like Kenya, where the poorest ethnic group, the Somali, have. So these are some analyses. But my question really is to take a step back into that measurement design and think about human rights and how they may come up in measurement design. So these are the terms that I've just introduced. Not that you can see them, but thinking of the indicators to choose, the categories or dimensions, the cutoffs or standards, what a right requires, and then if you want to go so far as to look at people who have a collection of things going wrong at the same time and recognize that they might be poorer than others, then a poverty cutoff. Some of the construction, therefore, of these poverty measures, although not all of it, requires normative choices. And this approach very much builds on, or attempts to build on, Umberto Sen's capability approach, and to measure unfreedoms, because that's a lot easier than measuring freedom or capabilities. And so following in that line, the normative choices are made explicitly and not simply by statistical uses. So now turning a little bit to a human rights framework, how has it engaged? 2 very preliminary examples. One is that simply some actors, in a sense, one of the questions was interesting earlier about, is this just a slogan with no content? I'm not sure it's a slogan, but some development actors simply use the word human rights and affix it to non-monetary aspects of poverty. So the Islamic Development Bank has this lovely Islamic Solidarity Fund for Development. And it's not a slogan. They are trying, in a sense, to bring together their framework of development assistance and then think about multidimensional measures. And a natural way to do it was to make the connection through human rights. Another, and this was quite interesting to us because I don't, unlike many of you here, I don't really know that much about the formal processes on human rights. but it was interesting that there was a mandate on extreme poverty, which is the word which the World Bank has used and affixed to its $1.90 a day poverty measures. And so I always use the word extreme poverty to refer to income poverty, and acute multidimensional poverty to refer to something else. But it was interesting that when they tried to articulate the relationship between extreme poverty and human rights, they recognized the shortfalls of simply using a monetary measure, and so argued that there might be links to a multidimensional poverty measure from that framework of seeking to understand extreme poverty. And we simply found this on the internet, one of our postdocs. So we don't really know where it comes from, but it was quite interesting to the folk in our group to see the work from a different angle. Now, there are two examples, as I mentioned, that I thought might be a little bit more interesting, because these do very much have a well-developed framework underlying them. And the first is Mexico's official national measure of poverty, which since December 2009 has been multidimensional. So the slides I'll present are from CONAVAL, the institution in Mexico authorized to produce this measure every 2 years as the official poverty statistic. And they are used with permission from the president of that institution, Gonzalo Hernández Licona. So they observed that when there were discussions about multidimensional poverty, one of the motivations was a mistrust of statistics, and therefore they wanted to rethink how they measured poverty. And they passed a law, the General Law of Social Development, which articulated not only that from thence poverty should be measured multidimensionally, but also what the dimensions should be. So in the law itself, it named 7 non-income dimensions of poverty, which are in yellow, except for the last one, degree of social cohesion, which actually was not used within Mexico's measure because it couldn't be measured in the same way. So first use of a legal framework was to articulate that a multidimensional measure needed to be framed as social rights, and that these particular rights needed to be included. They also set up a new institution because of historical circumstances, and gave a lot of emphasis, which continues to this day, on the importance of considering social rights integrally within the same measure of poverty as their traditional income poverty measure. Why were rights so important? Ex post, they argue that using a rights framework solves the problem of weights and thresholds. Because human rights are indivisible and interdependent, they all have the same relative weight and importance, so the weight that you affix to them is equal. And they were able to use legal regulations in most of the indicators in Mexico to affix the deprivation cutoffs, like the compulsory years of schooling, for example. So this was a great relief, because before this was discovered, we were wandering around the meetings, and the economists and statisticians were saying, how are we going to set the weights? How are we going to make these normative decisions? It's a very anxiety-creating issue. So it links back to John's question about the fear of normative questions. So what have they done? They've created, first of all, 2 divisions in society, those that do not have any deprivations in social rights and those that do. And second, those whose income lies below a poverty cutoff and those above it. And if you are both deprived in income and experience at least one deprivation in social rights, you are identified as poor. And then they also have a category of extreme poor, which are those people whose income is not even up to the food poverty line and who suffer simultaneously at least 3 deprivations in social rights. So that's their poverty measure, and they also then identify people who are vulnerable because they're income poor but not deprived in rights and deprived in social rights but not income. And the green box is nirvana. It's not to be deprived in anything. So the aim of public policy is to get people into the green. So just a couple observations on this. The first is that it was used, as I mentioned earlier, to visibilize deprivations, for example, of indigenous poverty. It was the first time in history Mexico had released poverty figures for the indigenous group. The second is that it was released in 2009 using 2008 data, which was fielded before the financial crisis. And in their first update, they were proudly able to show that deprivations in the social rights decreased, but due to their big bad neighbor, income poverty and because of food prices, food insecurity rose. So this gave some interesting conversations within Mexico because overall poverty rose, and yet because they looked at the social rights, they could also, in a governance sense, take credit for the reduction in those rights. Mexico also creates detailed poverty maps using census data. And the last point of analysis that I'll mention from Mexico is that from a human rights perspective, each person matters. And so many countries simply focus on the percentage of people who are poor. So in the lower right-hand corner, you see that in 2010, 46.2% of people were poor. And in 2012, that had reduced to 45.5%. So in most countries, that would be celebrated as a success. But Mexico actually is very honest, and it counts the number of people. And it was 52 million people in 2010, and despite the decrease in percentage of poverty, it was 53 million in 2012. So there was an increase in the number of poor. So this is an interesting case study because it is trying to implement a human rights perspective and drive it through not only in measurement design, but also in the analysis and interpretations of it. I won't go through the details of this, but it was interesting that in order to affix the weights and the poverty cutoff, they requested us to do an axiomatic justification of it. And we could only do it under certain conditions, which had to do with data quality. And to make a very long and technical story short, if the data were such that every measured deprivation of a social right was real, if there were no fashion models with low body mass index, if there were no self-made millionaires with not enough education who dropped out of school early, so if there were none of these spurious, non-poverty related deprivations, then we could say that a person was economically deprived if they were income poor, because there would never be errors, and that they had a social deprivation or violation of a social right if they had experienced any deprivation in any indicator. Both of those assumptions require very strong data quality. And therefore, because Mexico wanted balance between economic and social rights, a person was poor if and only if they had both deprivations. So you can make theorems out of this, and then you can bring in weights. So relating to the law required balance. We interpret balance as more or less half of a weight on each. And given that weight and the indivisibility and equal importance of the human rights, a weighting structure comes out very naturally. So that is how, in a sense, economists grabbed onto the ideas of human rights and used it to justify a measure, and particularly the difficult issues of weights and cutoffs. But I have also drawn attention to some of the dodgy assumptions, perhaps, that underlie it. And I'd like to end this case study with just one more observation, which perhaps conceptually is the most problematic, which is that we slide over the idea that a person who is income poor and has one social right violated is poor. But what about those who have a social right violated but are not income poor, or 2 rights, or 3 rights, or 4, or 5, or 6? By Mexico, they are invisible, they are vulnerable, but they are non-poor. And that perhaps is the most interesting. So we quantified this. I'm not sure we made many friends in doing so, but 0.1% of the Mexican population have all 6 rights being violated, but are not poor. But in terms of 3 deprivations, it's 5.6 of the Mexican population. So these numbers are getting quite high. And so there's a question, a conceptual question that needs to be raised about what is the status of social rights if they only are respected if they occur alongside income poverty. A very brief now touch on child poverty. The Child Rights Convention is the one that is drawn on a great deal by people seeking to measure child poverty, which clearly cannot be measured by money, and so clearly needs a structure. So the most well-known and the oldest child rights-based measure was by Dave Gordon in Bristol, which uses 8 equally weighted dimensions of child poverty and identifies a child as poor if they have at least 2. So this is an approach that does allow for dubious data quality, and it reports the percentage of children experiencing different deprivations. So this is, on the face of it, very clear, but the devil is in the details. How are each of these measured? So we replicated this. We only used children 0 to 5, and we replicated the same indicators. And for example, in the case of information, it's not having access to a radio or television. In the case of nutrition, it's stunting or wasting, but in health, it's immunization only. And so this, how the human rights are actually put in data terms and what cutoffs are affixed does raise questions. For example, it flows off the tongue that they should be equally weighted. But is it as important for a 3-year-old to have a radio as it is for them not to be malnourished? It seems, as we go into the details, perhaps that should be questioned. Similarly, health is simply measured by immunization, but so many other factors affect child health, not only sanitation, drinking water, and nutrition that are part of this measure, but also other circumstances. And then education is not measured for children 0 to 5 in the rights approach because they're not going to school, and the right is framed as addressing school. And yet clearly there are differences in cognitive development. So there are these kinds of issues come up anytime one moves, in a sense, into implementation. In Mexico, health meant having health insurance. But is that really the right to health? Food security in Mexico had to do with a particular food security index, which again is very contested. So a lot of the technical discussions about whether or not this indicator is a good representation of the right itself sometimes are clouded over, in a sense, by the enthusiasm, which is very right, of wanting to move out with a rights-based agenda. And there's another MODA updates with UNICEF continue, I think very rightly, to draw on the Convention on the Rights of a Child and also to call for more data that would enable measures more adequately to reflect the different rights that are there included. So I'll close with just a few observations. First is a very practical one. We work with governments, a network of 50 countries now, of governments who are implementing official national statistics of multidimensional poverty. And in working not only with Mexico but in others, human rights are simply one of the many inputs that they use. I don't know how people would feel about that status, but a legal status is important. So too is a national development plan. So too is the timing. Is this the right moment to put an emphasis on this indicator or that because of particular agendas, particular needs at the time? But then there are other kinds of inputs alongside human rights, like property issues or the practical constraints of the data that exist. And a particularly important input in many, many countries, as Paul Hunt mentioned, is actually deliberative insights from poor people and communities or from those who work extensively with them. So for example, in El Salvador and in many, many other places, there are extensive consultations about what is poverty. So in El Salvador, they took 2 years. The government had made a measure which had 4 dimensions, and then they took 2 years to consult and see what poor people in communities viewed poverty to be. And there were many insights that emerged, and they were able to translate these not only into English but also into indicators, and try to take some of them forward. But what was interesting in that dialogue was that, for example, violence or environmental conditions where you live was not part of the government's measure, yet it came up a great deal in the consultative processes, and it sparked a discussion about what is the limits of the government in terms of criminal violence, for example, and should that be included? Should places for children to play football or for old people to drink coffee, should they be included in the measure? So I think in violence, in a human rights term, that's not a problem at all. It very much fits. But how about places for children to play? Old people to drink coffee? These certainly came out as key. So many of the practical implementations do these kind of conversations and use them in part to legitimize the measures, but also in part to have improvements of the measures. I was showing pictures of Bhutan, where very much the poor communities changed the national measure. So those are a few of the observations, a little bit of a texture of how these measures are implemented in practice, how they try to appropriate very imperfectly some of the insights from the human rights literature. And I very much looking forward to your improvements, your suggestions of how to do this work better. So thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sabina, for these rich presentations. So, Colleen, you have the floor now.
Great, thank you. So first, thanks to John for the invitation to be here, and Sabina for her wonderful talk. I've long admired her work on multidimensional poverty assessments, and we share a rare but important bond with Champaign, Urbana, Illinois, the middle of the cornfields. So I'm trained as a philosopher, I work in a law school, and I collaborate with engineers. So my work and thinking about indicators is informed by that background. It's also informed by my particular interest in indicators, and that is in looking at the context of potential disruptions to development, specifically from war and also from natural disasters. And it's in the latter context, in the context of thinking about natural disasters, that I work with engineers. And I want to draw on that collaboration to focus on 2 issues in my comments. One is a certain frustration that I've had that maybe you can tell me I should curb, about trying to understand and grapple with the nature of the information that different indicators provide, and how that should inform our assessment of selection of indicators. And the second is about the place of uncertainty in thinking about and developing and using the information that indicators provide us with. So focusing on the first issue, when we look at multidimensional poverty assessments and the Sustainable Development Goals, they use very different kinds of indicators that seem to provide very different kinds of information. So the Global Multidimensional Poverty Index, as was illustrated above, looks at flooring, electricity, drinking water, and cooking fuel as indicators of living standards, and nutrition and child mortality as indicators of health. The Sustainable Development Goals include, as goal number 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions, and goal number 11, sustainable cities and infrastructure. And when you look at the indicators by way of assessing these goals, the indicators for sustainable cities and infrastructure include number of deaths, missing persons, and persons affected by disaster per 100,000 people, direct economic losses in relation to GDP, including disaster damage to critical infrastructure and disruption of basic services, population, proportion of a population that has convenient access to public transport, and in the case of peace, justice, and strong institutions, you see indicators such as conflict-related deaths per 100,000 population by sex, age, and cause, proportion of population reporting having personally felt discriminated against or harassed in the previous 12 months on the basis of a ground of discrimination prohibited under international human rights law, and proportion of children under 5 years whose age whose births have been registered with a civil authority. So when I look at these indicators, they seem to me to be capturing important differences or different kinds of information. One difference is between providing information about means and versus ends. Whereby means, I mean the conditions that reflect what individuals have or what they can do with what they have so as to achieve certain valuable functionings or achieve important freedoms. So when we think about registration of children under 5, registration of birth, we might not care about that as such or take that to be an important end in itself, but rather care about it because of the ways in which registration at birth might or often does be a means to accessing certain educational entitlements or healthcare entitlements or recognition as a member of a political community or as a safeguard against certain forms of discrimination. Similarly with electricity, we might not care about it for its own sake, but care about what it enables in terms of education insofar as children are able to study longer hours, insofar as that provides a tool that's needed for a transportation infrastructure to function. But other sorts of indicators seem to be capturing, by contrast, ends, not tools that enable us to do things that we care about, but things that we care about for their own sake. So nutrition seems to be a constitutive dimension of health, and death rates seem to be of concern precisely because they constitutively undermine the freedom one has to live. A second contrast seems to be between means and ends on the one hand that are not human rights and those that may be properly conceptualized as human rights. So we may have a right to nutrition, but we may not have a human right to certain flooring materials. One of my colleagues wants to argue that we have a right to energy, but that could be a contestable claim as to its status as a human right. We may value certain ends that don't rise to the level of thinking about human rights, so we value our lives, but we may not think we have an absolute safeguard or right against death stemming from certain natural disasters. So in thinking about these differences, if these differences are right, between indicators that are telling us about instrumental means for the attainment of ends that we care about, as opposed to information about the ends themselves, information that captures human rights claims and information that doesn't capture human rights claims, is there a certain kind of systematic prioritization that we ought to give to certain indicators vis-a-vis others? And secondly, how important is it to keep in mind what information indicators are providing when developing either composite index or frameworks for assessment? And my sense, though I stand to be corrected and would love to be corrected, is that there hasn't been much systematic discussion about this, about what is the role of keeping different sources of information that indicators are providing in mind. And I have a descriptive, a policy, and a moral worry about not doing this. So the descriptive worry is that failing to make these distinctions fails to adequately characterize what we have information about. That we're not necessarily assessing freedom in some cases, but conditions that often or typically are correlated with or influence freedoms that we care about. Not human rights, though sometimes we are concerned with and getting information about rights. So are we descriptively adequate in what we're presenting, claiming we have information about? The policy worry is that failure to distinguish between means and ends might lead to or risks valuing means for their own sake while losing sight about what the means are means for and the extent to which there might be other means that could be substituted for achieving the end that we actually care about, as well as worries about inaccurate conclusions that are drawn or implications when it comes to policies in the face of the information that we're provided with. Whereas if we're looking at means, we might want to know whether or not a deprivation of a certain mean does in fact erode or undermine the freedom that we care about. If we're getting information about certain freedom deprivations themselves, then we would want, by contrast, to know what is leading to those or causing those deprivations that we're concerned with. And the moral worry is that the failure to make these distinctions may lead to oversight of morally salient considerations and differences in the success or failure of meeting certain targets. So the violation of human rights, especially in the context of transitional justice in which I work as well, is seen not just as generating specific moral claims of redress that are backward-looking and that are distinct from more forward-looking claims to ensure certain targets are met moving forward. And so if some indicators are about human rights claims where they have that backward-looking claim to redress and others aren't, there's a worry about how we accurately keep all of those differences in mind. So Are my worries overstated? If they are not, how are they overcome, or to what extent are they being addressed in the ways in which we're dealing with indicators right now? And the second comment is just a comment about uncertainty. So the engineers that I work with are civil engineers whose areas of expertise are in risk and reliability analysis, and so uncertainty is the name of the game. And when I look at indicators and their uses, it seems to me there's 3 different sources or kinds of uncertainty that it's important to keep in mind. And the question I want to ask is how we communicate it and what is the normative upshot of them. So one kind of uncertainty is about the accuracy of the information that we're getting from the data that we're drawing on when measuring success or failure in meeting certain targets. And I know Sabina Alkire in her multidimensional poverty assessment tries to express that kind of information, right? The possibility of error or mistake. And other sorts of assessments fail to do that. But that's one source of information, of uncertainty. A second source of uncertainty can arise when we try to make backward-looking explanations for why we find the success or failures that we have in a particular case. Right, so explanations about the effectiveness of human rights enforcement mechanisms, the effectiveness of particular interventions, the effectiveness of the accuracy of explanations for why we find the levels of success or failure, achievement or not that we find. And in Paul Hunt's talk, he was very clear about avoiding the language of causation and trying to make the case for the effectiveness of different sorts of interventions, and I think that's a reflection of uncertainty. That's part of that. And then finally, a third kind of uncertainty stems from the fact that sustainable development is about security of achievements in the long term and in the face of certain risks. It's not just about achievements that we often get a snapshot picture of through the indicator assessments that we do, but we're concerned about the stability and security of those achievements over time in the face of perhaps chronic instability of achievements, or in the face of, increasingly with climate change, threats and risks from natural hazards and disasters. And so making assessments about the security of achievements requires making predictions about where indicators are likely to be over time, given certain potential hazardous scenarios or given certain possibly changing conditions. So in thinking about uncertainty, I just want to, these are questions for discussion for you, ask what constitutes effective ways of communicating uncertainty? How do you think about the importance of recognizing uncertainty? And what should the normative upshot of uncertainty be? So if you think about the consequences that fall from being categorized as poor or not poor, given a certain number of deprivations, or if we think about the normative claims that arise if you've been judged to have been suffered from a violation of human rights or not, or about how predictions about what the impact of a natural hazard might be would lead to or shape risk mitigation efforts. What role, if any, should uncertainty about the predictions we're making, the assessments that we're making, or the measurements that we're making, and play in the sort of conclusions we want to draw for what should be done from the perspective of policy or allocation decisions? So I'll end there. Thanks.
Thanks, Colleen. So I want to give Sabina a chance to offer a quick reply if she wants to, and then I'm going to take questions from the floor.
Thank you. That was very, very splendid and comprehensive, so I really appreciated it. I think you're right that there are not enough resources. We've tried to do a little bit in our patch. So in our book, one chapter is just on these normative choices, and very particularly in terms of ends and means, the first thing to do in designing a measure, and we ask all of the counterparts to do it, is to specify the purpose and the space. And that makes a big difference. So if the space in which you are measuring poverty, for example, is functionings, achieved functionings, which is what you can measure, we can talk about the relation to capability if you wish, then it matters how you construct the indicators. To give an example not relevant to the measure I just presented, but you might think years of schooling means 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, that they are linear. But in terms of human capabilities, the first year of education may have a lot more effect on your capability sets than other years. So it may not be a linear relationship. You might have to curve it, because in the space of capabilities, which is what you're trying to measure, you just can't take the data off the shelf. And I can give you lots and lots of examples about how you try to take the data and then think, well, how is this going to reflect human capabilities of different kinds across persons? In terms of mixing up causes or determinants and outcomes, again, it's a very clear step at the initial phase of measurement, recognizing that, as Sen would say, many things are both intrinsically valuable and instrumental to others. And so the extent to which you set weights, you might want to be thinking of the intrinsic values. Although very practically, there are two kinds of weights the government set. Some are reflecting their intrinsic value, and some are reflecting the priorities of the moment. And watching them, you see these two frameworks being used in different times. And finally, in terms of uncertainty, I think that that's vital. It's something we've tried to do very, very extensively in terms of documenting the standard errors of every measure, testing significance for every statement that is published, documenting the samples that are missing from our data sets, like the homeless, those who are institutionalized. The elderly are not captured in the data sets that we have. And so trying to be very systematic. Tony Atkinson chaired a commission for the World Bank, which will be releasing its report on Friday of next week, a week from today. And in that, he recommends that for both income and multidimensional poverty measures, they now always report what he calls total error. So not just the easy statistical thing you can bump out, but also really thinking through the sources of error of the data. And I think that reflects a general trend that we want people to understand the error, and so they can use it with caution, as it were. For example, we have made predictions of the global MPI, and I will not publish them because I don't think they're right. I don't think we understand that well enough, and so my answer is to be very conservative and not publish it unless we can somehow know how accurate the work is. I'll leave it at that.
Great, thank you. So, questions? Yes. All right.
What is the correlation between the index that you developed and GDP per capita across countries? Is it high, low? It's low, and what's the source of the lack of correlation?
Right. So if you look at high-income countries, they have very low multidimensional poverty. So that's the source of correlation, is if we had more high-income countries. This data set covers 100 countries, 5.4 billion people. It's 75% of the world population and about 93% of the low and middle income country population. But it's not very good on high income countries. So if we included them, the correlation would be higher. But for example, just to describe it, in low income countries, well, poverty ranges from 5% to 91%. So a 5% country is Kyrgyzstan. Kyrgyzstan last July moved to being lower middle income status. Until then it was low income status, and it had that since 2006 was the first time we got poverty levels at 5%. And in the low end, countries with less than $1,000 per capita have poverty rates from 29% in Nepal, again to 92%. So what happens is that in the low income, low poverty countries, institutions and social institutions are functioning better. Service delivery is better. And many of the countries have a legacy of some kind of, state-based approach. In terms of the upper middle income countries, for example, Namibia has 40% of people being poor, and it's an upper middle income country. So you'll know the context, you'll know some of the reasons for that. I think the missing feature, and we're doing lots of analyses now to try to distill it further, but clearly public expenditure and strength of institutions is telling some story. But it's not perfect. In Nepal, for example, the data are from 2006 when their peace accord was signed to 2011. Part of that period they didn't even have a government, and it's not an uncorrupt country. And so it's not the perfect governance story, although a country like Rwanda, not good on human rights, but fantastic on multidimensional poverty reduction. So it's quite complex how these institutions and social expenditures work. And there's not one story that goes across all the countries that we've been able to find. But please look and tell us if you find it.
Can I have a microphone here?
Thank you. I think this is very interesting how human rights principles have been kind of used in thinking about poverty measure. But I'm thinking about the relationship between development and human rights. And when you say that the authority of human rights being top-down and inflexible, in a sense, I don't think human rights actually have specific norms for poverty. The human rights framework has specific norms for the right to health, the right to food, the right to, but it doesn't have a sort of a cutoff line as to what constitutes poverty, sort of an unacceptable level of deprivation. I mean, and I don't think human rights standards actually say in very concrete terms. I mean, this is one of the problems with the non-specificity of human rights standards, that the right to food is not a right to so many calories of consumption. I mean, so there is a lot of issue there. So I'm not quite sure if I agree with that second point. But on the other hand, I think this is a case where this kind of essentially development economics research in the framework of capabilities and human development contributes, I think, to human rights analysis and human rights insights into what constitutes social deprivations that are not compatible with a life of dignity and freedom. So, and I think that's kind of empirical development studies research, which I think is very helpful to human rights analysis. And the third point is that, this looks at human rights enjoyment, substantive freedoms, and human rights enjoyment. But to jump from there to violations, I think is extremely dangerous, because this is not a measure, these are not measures of compliance with government obligations. And, taking off from the whole issue of resources, you cannot say that, the government of Sierra Leone is dramatically in violation of economic and social rights, whereas the government of the United States is not, because under 5 mortality is so much higher in Sierra Leone. You do have to take into account that you have multiples more economic resources plus much other kinds of resources to achieve those outcomes. So you do need to take account of this progressive realization to the maximum available resources concept and compare country achievements, if you're doing an inter-country comparisons, by focusing on government conduct. And this is what we have done in the SURF index. You're probably not aware of this index that we have, which develops this measurement that takes care of this problem of different levels of resources that are available in the country.
Yes, I should have said at the beginning, Sakiko, I meant to say that I focused on poverty partly because, Sakiko has written quite a bit on other measures more directly of human rights, and I thought that it might be of interest just to see how actors who are not trained in human rights, not explicitly, they're not coming from this perspective, but they're grabbing the word, they're grabbing some of the ideas, and should this be encouraged or not, is my question to you, or how could it be improved? But this is in a sense what's already at play. I showed the global MPI, but actually many of the countries, Rwanda, Tanzania, Senegal, they're also doing national measures. And what's interesting is that they're drawing then on their own frameworks, their own sets of what they think is feasible and important in their context to define the parameters of their own measures. Whether or not that's progressive realization presumably depends on how good those are. But no, I think it's a very point well taken. Thank you.
We have time for another question or two.
Hi, I'm Vivek Bhatt. I'm reading for the PhD in law at the University of Edinburgh. Thank you for a very interesting session. I have one question, and that was whether you might think that there's some little bit limiting about letting the state be the indicator of the level of multidimensional poverty. And the reason I asked that question is there was a comment right at the start of the day that human rights discourses since the start of this century, one of the focuses has been the rights of indigenous people. And in my national state, which is Australia, which is considered a developed state, in inverted commas, indigenous people often lack access to healthcare, to education, social services. They also live in areas which are most susceptible to natural disasters, and there are also other human rights violations, such as the inability to practice cultural traditions and also language. So the question that I kind of have is, do the panelists think that there may be in the future some kind of value to drilling below the level of the state for an indicator of multidimensional poverty if we're going to talk about this correlation between violations of human rights and poverty? Because there may be specific communities within states where overall the level of poverty is considered to be low. That could also do with some kind of academic attention and discussion.
Yes, that's very important on several different levels. So first of all, just a general point on state actors. These measures may be official statistics, which means that they are implemented by the National Statistics Organization using national data. But that doesn't mean that the state is the only actor. So for example, in Costa Rica, the work on multidimensional poverty, and they just had their first update, came out last night, and poverty went down. It was funded by the private sector. And the private sector has been very much a partner in government. So not only, for example, one of the largest banks is looking at the poverty of their employees, if their employees live in MPI poor families by the national definition as part of their CSR, but they're also actually investing money in the government poverty reduction program. So that's to say that this work is not, Colombia have a social map where they map the NGOs, the faith-based groups, the businesses and the state by census areas to say who's doing what on poverty. And Colombia has reduced its poverty very dramatically since 2011 when it launched its measure. A second point is that, yes, there are special populations. And there are two issues. One is that our data may not be representative by them. So for example, of these 100 countries, we only have data on disability for 10. And we don't have the good questions on disability that look at its severity for 6 of those. So the push now is to get better data on disability mainstream, so we can always, we have a representative sample and we can decompose it. Same by slums. Many urban areas are not representative by slums, at basic points. And so part of that is sample design, but it also may be the features. For example, there was in Mexico, they disaggregate by indigenous groups. But in Colombia, they actually developed a special measure for the indigenous population. Afro-Colombianos were some, and some were other indigenous groups, because those indigenous groups indeed felt that they had different housing requirements based on their indigenous housing structures. They wanted their local languages to be part of their deprivation profile. And so, in a sense, they needed a different measure. And the problem is that can't be compared to the national measure. I whipped through the slides for time, but 75% of the indigenous people in Mexico are poor by its national measure, and 46% of the population. So it's much higher, and Colombia can't do that comparison. There was another study of, I can't remember how many countries, 6 or more European countries, published by UNDP Bratislava, which studied the Roma population. And they basically had a nationally representative sample, and then they oversampled the Roma. And then they could really have a much more textual analysis of these pockets of poverty of important subgroups of the population. So I think there are ways to do it, but it requires enough of a gut instinct about how the sampling framework has to be changed, or how the questions need to be changed, so that there's an appropriate measurement framework for bringing out what is relevant, both for those communities and for policy.
Just one thing on your comment that your second response was pointing to. When I work with engineering graduate students, they often are data-driven in a problematic way, where they take the constraints of what they can work with to be driven by whatever data set they have available. And I'm constantly asking them to just take a step back and say, what information are you interested in? What information matters? Then go and look at a data set, both for the sense of seeing what might be available that would be useful, and what's missing, that you can draw attention to what it would be good to know or have.
Please join me in thanking our speakers for this great session.